It was a cold Thursday evening, and Sophie was nearing the end of her shift at Mel's Diner, a small, old-fashioned restaurant on the edge of town. She had been working there for 3 years, juggling long hours and night classes, trying to make ends meet while taking care of her younger brother. The diner wasn't busy, just a few regulars sipping coffee and an elderly couple finishing their dessert. That's when the front door swung open, and a man in a sharp navy suit strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the black and white tiled floor. Thomas Hargrove, a well-known businessman in the area, took a seat at the corner booth, exuding an air of impatience. Sophie recognized him immediately. He was one of those customers who saw service workers as invisible, people who existed solely to cater to his needs. Taking a deep breath, she approached with a polite smile and handed him a menu, but before she could even greet him properly, he waved her off dismissively. "I don't need a menu," he muttered, barely looking up. "I'll have a steak, medium rare, no fat, and make sure it's actually cooked right this time." His tone was sharp, condescending, as if he had been personally offended by some past dining experience here. Sophie simply nodded and jotted down the order, determined to stay professional. When she brought his drink, a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, he barely acknowledged her. Instead, he scrolled through his phone, occasionally sighing as if her very presence was an inconvenience. A few minutes later, she delivered his meal, placing the plate in front of him with practiced care. But as soon as he glanced at it, his expression darkened. He prodded the steak with his fork, shook his head in exaggerated disappointment, then pushed the plate away as if it carried a disease. "Are you serious?" he scoffed, his voice loud enough to turn heads in the diner. "I asked for medium rare. This is practically raw." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, he continued, "What kind of incompetence do you hire in this place? Maybe if you weren't so busy standing around, you'd actually do your job right." Heat rose to Sophie's cheeks, but she bit back her frustration. Years of working in customer service had taught her how to handle rude patrons, but something about this man's arrogance made her stomach twist. "I'm sorry about that, sir," she said, keeping her voice even. "I'll have the kitchen fix it right away." But Thomas wasn't done. He leaned back in his seat, smirking as if he enjoyed watching her squirm. "You know what? Forget it. I don't have time to wait for you to get it right." He reached for the check, scrawled something onto the receipt, and slid it across the table before tossing a single crumpled dollar bill next to it. Without another word, he stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out, leaving Sophie standing there, fists clenched at her sides. When she finally picked up the receipt, she felt her stomach drop. Written in bold, almost aggressive handwriting were the words, "Maybe if you were smarter, you wouldn't be stuck in a dead-end job. No tip." Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat, blinking back the sting of humiliation. The elderly couple at the next table exchanged sympathetic glances, but said nothing. The cook, Marco, who had seen the whole thing from behind the counter, let out a low whistle. "What a jackass," he muttered. "You okay?" Sophie forced a tight smile. "Yeah," she lied. "I'm fine." But she wasn't, because deep down, a small part of her wondered if Thomas was right. Sophie finished the rest of her shift in a daze, her mind replaying the humiliating scene with Thomas Hargrove over and over again. She tried to shake it off, to focus on cleaning the empty tables and refilling the salt shakers like it was just another night. But the weight of his words clung to her like an iron chain. She had dealt with rude customers before. Every waitress had. But something about this particular encounter left a deeper wound. Maybe it was because she was already exhausted, or maybe because a part of her feared that what he wrote on that receipt wasn't entirely wrong. With a forced smile, she bid goodnight to Marco and the few remaining regulars, then grabbed her coat and stepped out into the freezing night air. The walk home was short but brutal. The cold wind bit at her exposed skin as she wrapped her thin jacket tighter around herself. She had meant to buy a new coat before winter hit, but there was always something more urgent: a bill, groceries, rent. Reaching her small, dimly lit apartment, She quietly unlocked the door, careful not to wake her younger brother, Ethan, who was already asleep on the couch. At only 16, Ethan had already been through more hardship than most kids his age. After their mother passed away 2 years ago, Sophie had taken on the role of caretaker, balancing 2 jobs and community college to keep them afloat. She hated that he had to see her struggle, but there wasn't much she could do about it. Sophie dropped her bag on the table and sighed as she saw the pile of unpaid bills stacked neatly beside it. Electric bill, past due. Rent, overdue. A medical bill from Ethan's recent hospital visit that she hadn't even dared to open yet. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping in. She had been planning to pick up an extra shift this weekend, but after what happened tonight, she wasn't sure she could stomach dealing with more customers like Thomas. What if he was right? What if she was stuck in this job forever, scraping by on minimum wage, dealing with people who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience? Shaking off the thought, she moved toward the small kitchenette, opening the fridge only to be met with near-empty shelves. A carton of expired milk, half a loaf of bread, and a few eggs were all they had left. She'd have to make do until payday. She reached for the eggs when she noticed something out of place, a white envelope sticking out from under the pile of mail. It had no return address, no postage, just her name scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. Frowning, she hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 simple words. "You don't deserve this. Keep going." Her breath caught in her throat. Who would send something like this? Her first instinct was that it was from a friend, maybe Marco or one of the regulars from the diner trying to lift her spirits, but something about the note unsettled her. The handwriting was clean, precise, almost too perfect, like it had been printed rather than written. And why now, on the same night, she had been humiliated by Thomas Hargrove? Her fingers tightened around the paper as she scanned it again, as if expecting more words to magically appear. But there was nothing, just that single cryptic message. A shiver ran down her spine, and she glanced toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside watching her. But there was only darkness. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the room as she swallowed hard, telling herself she was just being paranoid. It was probably nothing, just a kind gesture from someone who had seen how tired she was, right? Deciding not to dwell on it, Sophie folded the note and tucked it inside a drawer before heading to the couch. Ethan stirred slightly but didn't wake as she pulled a blanket over him. For a long time, she just stood there, watching the slow rise and fall of his breathing, letting the warmth of his presence ground her. Whatever was happening, she needed to stay focused. There was no time for mysteries or paranoia. Tomorrow was just another day, and she had no choice but to keep going. But as she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, the words on the note echoed in her mind. "You don't deserve this. Keep going." And for the first time that night, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, someone out there knew something she didn't. Sophie arrived at Mel's diner the next morning feeling drained, both physically and emotionally. She had barely slept, her mind occupied with too many thoughts. The humiliation from Thomas, the mysterious note, the unpaid bills piling up at home. But she had no time for self-pity. The diner wasn't going to run itself, and she needed the money. Keep going. The words from the note replayed in her head as she tied her apron and prepared for another long shift. The morning rush came and went. Sophie moved through the motions, taking orders, refilling coffee, offering tired smiles to regulars who noticed the exhaustion in her eyes. By noon, the diner had settled into its usual midday lull, with only a handful of customers scattered throughout the booths. She was in the middle of wiping down a table when the front door swung open and he walked in. Thomas Hargrove. For a brief second, Sophie froze. Her stomach tightened, a wave of dread washing over her as she watched him step inside. But something was different. Gone was the arrogant businessman from the night before. His usual self-assured stride was replaced with something else, hesitation, maybe even unease. He stood just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the diner as if he wasn't sure he should be there. Then, his gaze locked onto Sophie. The air in the room seemed to shift. Marco, who had been pouring coffee behind the counter, glanced up, his expression darkening as he recognized the man who had humiliated Sophie less than 12 hours ago. One of the regulars, Mrs. Dawson, an elderly woman who always sat by the window, turned in her seat to watch. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen. Sophie forced herself to stay calm. "Table for one?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral, professional. Thomas hesitated. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if struggling to find the right words. "Yes," he finally said, his voice lower, subdued. She led him to a booth, the same booth from last night. He sat down, clasping his hands together on the table, his posture tense. For the first time since she had met him, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked lost. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, pretending this was just another customer. Just another order. "Coffee," he muttered. "Black." Sophie nodded and turned toward the counter. Feeling Marco's eyes on her, he leaned in as she grabbed the coffee pot. "What the hell is he doing back here?" he whispered. "No idea," she admitted, but something in her gut told her this wasn't just a coincidence. She returned to Thomas's table, setting the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He stared at it, fingers twitching slightly, as if debating whether to pick it up. Sophie cleared her throat. "Do you need a menu, or—" "I need to talk to you." The words came out so abruptly that she blinked in surprise. I need to apologize," he added, shifting in his seat. He wasn't looking at her now, but rather at the coffee in front of him, like he couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. Sophie narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms. "Apologize?" He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "About last night, I was out of line." That's an understatement. A faint, humorless smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah," he admitted. Then, as if mustering all the courage he had, he finally lifted his eyes to hers. "Something happened after I left here." Sophie frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas hesitated again. His fingers tapped against the ceramic coffee cup, his expression unreadable. "I don't expect you to believe me," he said slowly, "but I think I experienced something I can't explain." Sophie arched a brow. "Like what?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I left here feeling angry, right? I was in a terrible mood. I got in my car, drove home, went to bed. But when I woke up this morning," he paused, his fingers tightening around the handle of the coffee cup. "It was last night. Again." Sophie blinked. "What?" "I mean it," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I woke up, and it was Thursday night. Again. Like I was reliving it." A chill ran down Sophie's spine. "You mean like a dream?" "That's what I thought at first," he admitted, "but it felt real. Too real. I got out of bed, checked my phone, the time, the date. Everything was exactly the same as it had been before I came here last night." He let out a shaky breath. "And when I came back to the diner in this replay of the night, I watched myself walk through the door." Sophie's stomach dropped. "You saw yourself?" "Yes," he whispered, "sitting right there. Same suit, same booth, same exact moment I came in last night. I watched myself interact with you, say all the same things, leave the same receipt." He finally looked up again, his eyes filled with something Sophie never thought she'd see from a man like Thomas: fear. "And then I saw you pick up the receipt, and I saw your face when you read it, and suddenly I felt sick." Sophie stared at him, unsure how to respond. Thomas swallowed hard. "I don't know how to explain it, but it wasn't just like a dream. It was like I was being forced to watch myself, to see myself through your eyes." He let out a small, bitter laugh. "It wasn't a great experience." Sophie didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a folded piece of paper. And then This morning, this morning, I found this on my desk. He slid it across the table toward her. Sophie hesitated before picking it up. The moment her eyes landed on the writing, her breath caught. It was the exact same handwriting from the note she received at home. The one that said, "You don't deserve this. Keep going." But this note wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to Thomas. And it said something else entirely. "Now you understand. Do better." Sophie's fingers tightened around the note as a strange, creeping sensation settled over her. The handwriting was identical to the note she had received at home. The same precise, almost mechanical strokes, as if it had been printed rather than written. But this time, the message wasn't for her. It was for Thomas. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his, searching his face for any sign that this was some elaborate joke. "This isn't funny," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know," Thomas replied, running a hand through his hair. He looked different from the arrogant businessman she had met the night before. He looked rattled. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "It was on my desk this morning," he said, "just sitting there. No envelope, no explanation. Nothing." Sophie hesitated. "Does anyone else have access to your office?" He shook his head. "No one. I locked the door when I left last night." Sophie stared at the note again, her pulse quickening. If Thomas was telling the truth. And she wasn't sure she was ready to believe that yet. Then someone had gone to great lengths to make sure he received this message. But why? And more importantly, who? She set the note down carefully, as if it might vanish at any moment. "So let me get this straight," she said, folding her arms. "You left here last night, went home, and somehow relived the entire evening." "Yes." "And you actually saw yourself in the diner." "Yes." "And then you woke up this morning, for real this time, and found this note." Thomas exhaled sharply, nodding. "Yes." Sophie chewed on her lip. "That doesn't make any sense. You think I don't know that?" Thomas snapped, his frustration bleeding through. He pinched the bridge of his nose, taking a deep breath before speaking again, his voice calmer. "I'm not expecting you to believe me, Sophie. Hell, I don't even know if I believe me. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt." Sophie studied him. There was something in his eyes, a deep, unsettling fear that wasn't there before. This wasn't just guilt. This was something else. Marco, who had been listening from behind the counter, finally spoke up. "Maybe you had some bad seafood and hallucinated the whole thing." Thomas shot him a glare, but Sophie barely heard him. Her mind was racing. Someone had left her a note the night before. Someone had left Thomas a note this morning. And somehow, their messages were connected. "You said you saw everything play out the exact same way," she said suddenly. "Every word, every action. But when you saw yourself leave the note on the receipt, did you still write the same message?" Thomas hesitated. "Yes." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. "So even though you were experiencing it all over again, you didn't do anything differently?" Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked away, jaw clenched. "I don't know." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "You had a second chance to change things. But you didn't." Thomas rubbed his temples. "I wasn't thinking about it like that. I didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late." Sophie tapped her fingers against the table. "And then this morning, you get a note telling you to do better." Thomas looked at her, silent. Sophie exhaled, feeling the weight of something she didn't fully understand pressing down on her. She had spent years working at this diner, dealing with rude customers, bad tips, long shifts. But nothing like this had ever happened before. A thought occurred to her. "Why did you come back here today?" Thomas blinked. "You could have just ignored all of this," she continued, "pretended it was a dream. But instead, you came back. You sat at the same table. You waited for me." Thomas swallowed hard. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted. Sophie frowned. "What do you mean?" He let out a shaky breath. "Something feels unfinished. I don't know how to explain it, but I woke up this morning with this overwhelming feeling that I had to come back here. Like I wasn't done yet. Sophie glanced at the note again. Now you understand. Do better. She wasn't sure what was more unsettling. The fact that Thomas had seemingly relived the same night twice, or the possibility that someone or something was watching them, leaving messages in perfect handwriting, waiting for them to figure it out. Marco crossed his arms. So what now? You think some ghost is trying to teach you a lesson? Sophie shot him a look, but Thomas didn't laugh. I don't know, he said, but I'm starting to think this isn't just about me. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? Thomas hesitated, then reached into his pocket again. There was something else in my office this morning, he said. Not just the note. Slowly, he pulled out a second piece of paper and placed it on the table. Sophie's heart nearly stopped when she saw it. It was a receipt from Mel's Diner. The date was for tonight, a day that hadn't happened yet, and scrawled at the bottom, in the same eerie handwriting as the notes, was a single line. You are not finished yet. Sophie's hands trembled as she picked up the receipt, her pulse hammering in her ears. The date on it, tonight, sent a wave of cold dread through her. It was impossible, absolutely impossible. She looked up at Thomas, half expecting him to smirk and tell her this was some elaborate prank. But his expression was unreadable, his fingers tapping restlessly against the edge of the table. What the hell is this? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas shook his head. I was hoping you could tell me. Sophie exhaled sharply, forcing herself to think. A receipt for tonight. A message saying, you are not finished yet. The implications of it sent her mind spinning. It was as if someone, or something, knew that they would both be here again before the day was over. Marco, who had been watching the exchange with increasing skepticism, finally spoke. All right, I've heard enough. This is getting weird. He grabbed the receipt from Sophie's hand, scanning it with narrowed eyes. You sure you didn't just print this yourself? He asked Thomas. Thomas scowled. With what? A magic time-traveling printer? Marco grunted, handing the receipt back. I don't like this. Feels like a setup. Sophie wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The note at her apartment, the time loop Thomas swore he had experienced, and now this, it was too much to ignore. Someone was pulling the strings. All right, she said slowly, pressing her palms against the table as she tried to steady herself. Let's think logically. Maybe someone is playing a trick on us. Maybe it's some kind of elaborate hoax. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. A hoax? Who would go through all this trouble? I don't know, Sophie admitted, but there has to be an explanation. Thomas leaned forward, his expression intense. Or maybe, he said, voice low, we're meant to be here tonight. Sophie stiffened. What do you mean? She asked carefully. Thomas hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. Look, I don't know who or what is behind this, but after last night, after reliving everything exactly the same way, I can't shake this feeling that I'm supposed to do something different. That maybe this is my chance to change something. Sophie swallowed. Change what? Thomas exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. I don't know yet, but I have this overwhelming feeling that if I don't come back here tonight, something worse might happen. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Marco rubbed the back of his neck. All right, now I really don't like this. If this was some time loop thing, then why didn't you see this happen last night? Why didn't you see yourself coming back today? Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it, as if the thought had only just occurred to him. Sophie's breath caught. He's right. Last night, Thomas had supposedly relived everything. Every second of his evening at the diner, every action, every word. But in his time loop, he never returned the next day, which meant that whatever was happening now was different. A new possibility crept into Sophie's mind, making her skin prickle. What if, she started slowly, her fingers tightening around the receipt, what if someone Whoever or whatever's behind this wants you to break the loop. Thomas's eyes darkened. Then what happens if I don't? Sophie shuddered. She didn't want to know. A thought hit her like a brick, making her stomach drop. Wait, she said suddenly. What time was this receipt printed? Thomas turned the slip over. There, near the bottom, was a timestamp. 10:37 p.m. Sophie's breath caught. That's almost the exact time you left the diner last night. Thomas's jaw clenched. So, whatever happens tonight at 10:37. Sophie's pulse raced as she looked around the diner, suddenly hyper-aware of its every detail. The creaky floorboards, the hum of the overhead lights, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. It all felt fragile, like a moment in time that wasn't supposed to exist. A cold realization settled over her. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. Something was coming, and she had a sinking feeling that by the time the clock hit 10:37 tonight, she would find out exactly what it was. Sophie's fingers drummed anxiously against the diner counter. The clock above the kitchen door read 10:36 p.m. Thomas sat across from her, silent, staring at the receipt from the future, a moment that hadn't happened yet. She had been through too much in the last 24 hours to dismiss anything as coincidence. The humiliation she suffered, the mysterious note in her mail, Thomas's bizarre experience of reliving time, and now, a receipt predicting that something was going to happen at 10:37 p.m. She needed answers. The diner was nearly empty. Marco wiped down the counter, while an old radio crackled softly in the background. Mrs. Dawson sipped her tea by the window, oblivious to the tension thickening in the air. Then, 10:37 p.m., the door swung open. A man entered. Not a stranger. It was Leo. Sophie's eyes widened in shock. Leo was the shift manager at the diner, but he wasn't supposed to be here. He had quit 2 months ago. He had left under weird circumstances. No explanation, no goodbye. Just vanished. Leo walked in with purpose, his gaze locked on Sophie and Thomas. He carried a stack of papers under his arm, and he looked nervous, almost guilty. Sophie, he said, glancing at Thomas briefly before focusing back on her. I owe you an explanation. Sophie frowned. An explanation for what? Leo let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. For everything. Thomas narrowed his eyes. You know what's been happening. Leo hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. And before you start freaking out, no, there was no time loop. No ghost sending notes. No paranormal anything. Sophie crossed her arms. Then start talking. Leo sighed. All right, here's the truth. He placed a stack of papers on the table. Sophie glanced at them. Employee reports, pay stubs, a log of complaints, and then a list of diner security footage access logs. Leo pointed to a specific entry from the night before. 10:37 p.m. Someone had access to security cameras remotely. Thomas and Sophie exchanged a look. What does this have to do with us? Sophie asked. Leo exhaled. I was running a little side hustle when I worked here. Sophie raised an eyebrow. What kind of side hustle? Leo hesitated. Credit card skimming. Sophie's stomach dropped. I had a guy, Leo admitted. A tech guy. He helped me install a little device on the diner's payment system. It wasn't a big operation, just a few skim cards here and there. Small amounts. Nothing that would draw attention. He rubbed his temples. But 2 months ago, I realized someone had figured it out. I panicked, so I wiped the system and quit. Sophie felt her pulse quicken. And you think I knew something? Leo nodded. Not intentionally, but one of the last payments processed before I wiped everything was yours. Sophie's mind reeled. So you left me a note? Leo shook his head. No, I didn't send you a note. But whoever did, they knew what was happening. Thomas leaned forward. What about me? Why the hell did I feel like I relived the same night twice? Leo winced. That was actually my fault, too. He gestured toward the stack of papers. See, I still had remote access to the diner security cameras. I wanted to check if the system was clean, but when I logged in last night, he paused. I saw what happened to you, Thomas. Thomas frowned. You saw me humiliate Sophie? Leo nodded. And I saw how you look when you read the receipt. Sophie's breath hitched. Leo continued. Something about it stuck with me. I don't know why, but I had this weird feeling like maybe if you could see it happen again, you'd get it. Thomas's face darkened. What are you saying? Leo sighed. I edited the security footage. I looped it and played it back for you when you checked your phone this morning. Thomas's jaw tightened. You mean you didn't relive time? Leo confirmed. You just watched yourself being an ass twice. Sophie's stomach flipped. Leo turned to Sophie. As for the receipt predicting tonight, that wasn't me. But I think whoever sent that note to you at home, they wanted you to be here. To finally get the truth. Sophie couldn't believe it. Everything had been engineered. Not supernatural. Not impossible. Just carefully orchestrated by someone who had been watching. And suddenly, she knew. Mrs. Dawson, the old woman by the window. Sophie turned to look at her, and for the first time, Mrs. Dawson met her eyes and smiled knowingly. Leo followed her gaze and nodded. She's been eating here for 20 years. She sees everything. She probably put it together before any of us did. Sophie exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. It had all been a setup, a calculated chain of events designed to make the truth come out. Thomas ran a hand down his face, laughing bitterly. Jesus, I really thought I had traveled through time. Sophie smirked. You just got a replay of your worst moment. Thomas let out a deep sigh. And I deserved it. Leo stood. I came back to make things right. I'll go to the police and turn myself in. You don't deserve to get caught up in this. Sophie, she studied him for a long moment. No, I don't. Leo nodded, then walked out of the diner. Sophie sat back, feeling lighter for the first time in days. Thomas rubbed his temples. Well, I guess I owe you an actual apology. Sophie picked up the old receipt from last night. She flipped it over and scribbled 3 words before handing it to him. Thomas read it. Now, and this time, he really did.